Good day, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Addressing the Climate Crisis with Green Housing for All. I'm Jen Hawes, the Partnership Manager here at Island Press. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some logistics. The webinar will flow as follows. We'll start with a brief presentation from Dana Bourland outlining the overall concepts associated with the dual climate and affordable housing crises. Following that, Kim Vermeer will discuss some solutions to the problem. After the presentation, Don Phillips will give opening remarks about how community wealth and racial justice are central to these issues. He'll then moderate our conversation. We will open it up to questions from the audience after these opening remarks and initial questions. There we go. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. To do so, please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. It should be on the right side of your screen and look like this. If you have any problems, you can use the chat box to connect with the organizers, and that should be also in the GoToWebinar control panel. Following the webinar, you will receive a link to a brief survey. Your feedback is imperative to Island Press's ability to continue providing these free webinar events. We encourage you to fill out the survey. And this webinar event will be recorded today. You can expect to receive that recording in the next few days. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher founded in 1984. Our mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment. We elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on crucial issues, and focus attention on sustainable solutions, just like we're doing here today. If you're interested in purchasing either of the books that the authors are going to be speaking about today, we're offering a nice discount on them from islandpress.org. Use the code webinar, all caps, to purchase either of those books from the website. I'd now like to introduce today's participants. Dana Bourland is Vice President for the Environment at the JPB Foundation. Prior to this, Dana was Vice President of Green Initiatives for Enterprise Community Partners, a nonprofit dedicated to making well-designed homes affordable. She's developed and oversaw all aspects of Enterprise's Green Communities program, including the creation of the Green Communities criteria and Enterprise's multifamily retrofit program. A returned Peace Corps volunteer, Dana is an Ironman finisher, a runner, and an avid traveler. Kim Vermeer is an interdisciplinary green building and sustainability practitioner with a special focus in the multifamily and affordable housing sectors. Committed to delivering the benefits of green buildings to vulnerable populations, she offers strategic consulting to developers and owners to advance sustainability and climate resilience. Ms. Vermeer is also an experienced teacher and educator and has developed and facilitated many professional education and peer learning events. Her background includes housing finance, policy, and development. Kim is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer. She served her time in the Kingdom of Tonga. Don Phillips is the Executive Director of the Right to the City Alliance. He has been a grassroots organizer engaged in a range of social, economic, and racial and environmental justice organizations and fights in both the Bay Area and nationally for over 20 years. Prior to joining Right to the City, Don was the program director at Causa Justa, Just Cause, a grassroots organization focused on community development, housing, and immigrant justice issues in the Bay Area. Don previously served as the executive director of People United for a Better Oakland, or Pueblo, and as the organizing director of the community organizing team of Building Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency. Don is an immigrant from Singapore and a male-identified transgender person based in the occupied Ohlone territory, also known as Oakland, California. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Dana. One moment, please.
Great, thanks, Jen. And someone could just let me know if you can see my slides. I'm hoping you can, otherwise I am just gonna proceed.
Not yet.
Was that a yes?
They're up now.
Great, okay, terrific. Thanks so much, Jen, for organizing this event. Okay, terrific. And thanks, Jen, for organizing this event, and to Island Press for taking us on as authors and publishing our books. I've learned so much from my colleagues on this event today. Both Kim and Dawn are leaders in this field, and it's just a real honor to join them both. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to your questions. As Jen said, I'm Dana. I use she, her pronouns to describe myself. I'm actually zooming in, or I guess we're webinaring in, from the Lenape and Wappinger land. And as I write in my book, the first steps towards green communities is recognizing the history of the land and its people. And part of the greater green transition is recognizing land sovereignty and the right of the people to have effective access to, control over, and use of their land. So, you know, my book is really about making quantum leaps in equitably addressing the dual crises of climate change and housing affordability in one fell swoop, as I like to say, by going gray to green. And, you know, we all know this most likely, but it's definitely worth repeating that we're at an extraordinary point in our human history. The people who have had the least to do with creating the housing and climate crises are facing the impacts of both on a daily basis. And it's traumatic because you just don't know from day to day when that rug is going to get pulled out from under your feet again. And the problem is that the way we are producing and preserving housing in this country is just not meeting demand. And it's at odds with our collective need to take action to curb the carbon emissions and avoid catastrophic planetary collapse. It's not common knowledge, but 20% actually of all of our carbon emissions in the United States stem from heating, cooling, and powering our homes, making our homes actually the world's 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So you could compare that to the country of Brazil, or our emissions of our homes are more than Germany's. So just think about that for a moment and what that means. And a lot of us are looking for sort of quick solutions, but even if we electrified the entire grid, we decarbonized it, I mean, it would be insufficient to reducing carbon emissions to a level that would avoid even more severe impacts than what we are experiencing today, because half of all the housing in this country is at least 40 years old, if not older, and the occupants of those homes will continue inefficiently using fossil fuels if there's not an intervention. And not only does this have a price in terms of the cost of disasters, which is accumulatively increasing, but it traps people in obsolete homes, paying higher utility bills, often at least 3 times more than homes that are more energy efficient. And when I say people, I should be very clear. These are people who are already paying at least 50% more of their income for their rent or their mortgage. And these are people who are already choosing between food or fuel, mortgage or medicine, let alone any fun time with the family or pursuit of further education. As Charlotte, a woman I met in North Carolina, says, she always eats cheap during electric bill week. And because of our racialized land use policies and our history of racist housing practices, these are majority Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. And also on any given night, over 500,000 people are without a home altogether, weathering storms, they were weathering the pandemic, continued to be weathering the pandemic, and work schedules from makeshift dwellings. Not because these are bad people, but because our systems have failed. We have failed. And I get very frustrated about these facts because we know better, we can definitely do better. And I propose that we do better by making a quantum leap and addressing these issues and using a roadmap that has been around for close to 2 decades called the Green Communities Criteria. And it requires using the criteria for every housing and construction type. And what I mean when I say gray or green is that gray connotes practices that benefit a few in the short term, but negatively impact the majority of us and the planet. And while green connotes practices that benefit all of us while supporting the health of our planet now and for the long term. An example of how green is better, and Kim's going to get to this, I know, in her presentation. So I'll just give one example of a woman I met in Austin, Texas, named Tracy. And she had just moved into her apartment. She didn't know it was green, but she knew she could afford it. And her utility bills were half what they were in her previous gray apartment because her apartment was now energy efficient and it relied on solar to generate electricity and heat the water. But after moving in, as she told me, she started experiencing these other co-benefits, including that her son was sleeping through the night because his asthma was not getting triggered in the home, because the home contained healthy materials and it had the right type of mechanical ventilation and air circulation. Things we now know living through COVID are incredibly important to our indoor air quality. And you might think that these co-benefits are my main point here. But my main point is that her home was affordable. She was able to move into this apartment because she could afford it. And this is what we need in this country. It should not be up to luck of the draw. It should not be up to what zip code you find yourselves in. Everybody should be receiving the benefits that we have found can come from green housing. And what I also love about this example is that this part of Austin had actually become a dumping ground for appliances and who knows what. But the community had just kind of had enough, and they took it upon themselves to create a community land trust. And they decided that part of these parcels of land, they would make housing that would be permanently affordable. And then the housing, the part of the land that wasn't created for housing, they set aside and allowed it to the waste site that had become there because of people's dumping. They allowed the earth to regenerate itself and to create this beautiful now green space and actually a wetland area that's a wonderful amenity. When I was there, I walked out of Tracy's apartment and I just saw this beautiful green space right in front of me. And now Tracy has access to that every day, and the community has access to that every day. And we know how important access to green space is for our own mental health and well-being. And I use this example because often we think of green affordable housing as an output, sort of a better product, but it's actually a better process. It's an integrative and holistic one that extracts less harm and delivers more benefits across the entire process, from energy production to materials manufacturing, to transporting materials to the job site, to where those materials end up, and ultimately how the whole process can improve people's lives and the communities and planet we share. Now, in terms of climate, there's a lot of examples of how green communities address the climate crisis. Perhaps the most talked about one is that we can measurably and verifiably actually reduce carbon emissions. But green communities' homes are also located in smart places, which results in the reduction of emissions associated with vehicle trips. And the green communities criteria call for using building materials that don't contain the toxic byproducts and feedstocks of the fossil fuel industry. And this is probably the most under-discussed and under-acknowledged part of the climate conversation. And it's still one of the more difficult parts of the green communities criteria probably to meet, as Kim will talk in her presentation about a wonderful development in Minneapolis called Aon that pursued the living building petals to provide healthy products and materials in that development. And they did so while keeping all of the homes affordable. But it's our production of petrochemicals that gets put into these building materials like adhesives and cabinets and carpets and insulation. And they're not only causing climate change, but the pollution from that manufacturing process doesn't just go neatly up into the atmosphere. It pollutes the air outside and inside the homes and schools of the people who live nearby. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my slides on here. So the framework for doing this, as I mentioned, already exists with the Green Communities criteria. It's evolved over the last 15 plus years in response to new evidence, advancements in technology, and input from practitioners and residents. It's evidence-based, proven methods and materials. It's tried and tested over 127,000 homes, and it's endorsed by important stakeholders like 27 housing finance agencies, and it's the basis of Fannie Mae's green financing loans, making Fannie Mae a leader in the green financing marketplace because they know it's good business and they're not afraid to underwrite the cost savings that result from green construction. What also happens is now that Green Communities is being put into various cities' housing policies, like in Atlanta, Georgia, it's now part of the mechanism to get financing for the housing being developed around the Beltline. And so this has allowed the Phoenix House to receive financing to retrofit in a green manner. And I believe Kim may also talk about Phoenix House later. And, you know, so the criteria have been proven, they're tried and tested, and they're endorsed. But we still have a long ways to go. And I feel strongly, and maybe that's come across today in this presentation, but certainly in the questions and conversation we'll have later, we have to stop locking people into obsolete housing that they cannot afford and puts them in harm's way while doing nothing to address the climate crisis. Because when we pollute to make our cheap materials and our dirty energy, that pollution affects all of us now, and it will for generations to come. But it's not about me and how I feel, it's really about what we can do together. We can use our tools, our power, our influence, and we can make it happen. It's within our grasp to do so, and I do hope that all of you joining us today will join us in making this quantum leap together to avert the dual crises of climate change and housing affordability in one fell swoop from gray to green. So with that, thank you very much, and I will hand it over to Kim.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Just let me get my slides going. Show mode, please. All right, we're good to go. Well, I'm so excited to be here today and to be presenting with Dina and Dawn, and also thank Island Press for being the host and bringing these two books together, because they're great complements to each other. Dana, in her book, has really laid out a case for disrupting the entire system. And she's given great evidence to reinforce that the worst way to think about climate and the housing crisis is to think of them separately. And that the more we can do to tackle them together, the better. And there's been a huge amount of work in the affordable housing industry, much of it led by the leadership of the enterprise community partners through the Green Communities criteria. And I have to give a shout out to my co-author on this book, Walker Wells, who I believe is tuning in today. So hi, Walker. Walker wrote the first version of the Blueprint for Greening Affordable Housing a number of years ago, and I had used it for teaching. And that first edition really was at the place and at the time when we were still making the case for why green mattered in affordable housing. But as there was wider adoption, it became clear that it's not so much, needing to make the case, but helping people understand how to make it happen. And so we wrote the book. We're going to talk this through, why we wrote it and what's in it, because we really wanted to give guidance and put in one place the practical steps that the affordable housing industry can take together to build green housing. And so I'll just briefly talk about what's in the book, and I'm going to feature two case studies. And as Dana said, these are both case studies that, as it happens, she or enterprise have had a role in helping to create as strong examples of green affordable housing. And then we'll finish up with some findings and trends from the work that Walker and I did in researching and then writing the book. So we all know that the last year has only made these topics even hotter in the world of community development and affordable housing development. We are seeing, of course, health and the connections between health and housing and the pandemic and its effect on people. We are thinking more and more about social equity and racial equity and everything that's happened in the last few years. Of course, it's been going on forever, but the focus that it's gotten has really made us rethink what it means to be developing in an equitable way. And the climate crisis is only getting worse and more apparent, and our need to work to change that is stronger than ever. And of course, we saw what housing insecurity and inequities have been, and these are just, few highlights. I know all of us are seeing headlines every day with these kind of topics of the impact that the pandemic is having, the economic insecurity, the housing insecurity, the disproportionate impacts of both the COVID-19 itself and the economic fallout. And so we wrote the book really for the whole affordable housing industry, but with a special focus on the real estate project managers, because they are the ones who are making this happen every day as they develop and build projects. And they have these core functions that they have to execute on. They have to think about how a project is going to serve their community. They need to bring the whole design team together with the ownership, make it work within the financing structure. They have to get it built. They need to work with the operations team to think about how it's going to be operated and do this all in a way that contributes to the health and well-being of the people who will live there and the community that surrounds it. And then when we ask them to do it in a green way, that adds the outer ring of this wheel where they begin to ask questions like, is this a walkable community? How are we making it resilient? How are we contributing to or strengthening local services and local retail? How are we engaging residents both in the planning and in the operations and the community building that this project is contributing to? And we wanted to have in one place some key tools for how to do this and examples of where this is happening in all different kinds of projects and in all different places. And so we've got chapter content. First, we go through a little bit of the why greening affordable housing, just reinforcing some of the points that Dana made about how it's really complementary. The building green, building equitably, building for the environment, building for the economy. And then we go through the development process in detail and how to finance it as well. We have a chapter on how to green properties through operations, both new properties and existing ones, and talk about these trends of climate, of health, of social cohesion and social equity, and how strengthening our understanding and implementation of the fundamentals makes it more possible for us to lean into and address those trends. And then we've got 14 case studies of projects from all around the country who have been doing leadership in building green. We like the quote from Jonathan Rose that we are part of the solution. Everything that we do contributes to that call that Dana has made to go from gray to green. And it's very exciting to see the work that's going on. And when we talk about sustainable development, one of the classic definitions is that we're meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And another frame is to say it's a way of balancing the 3 E's of environment, equality, and economy, and seeing how we can make sure that that is done in a socially equitable way. And with the case studies, we show that this can be done for any kind of housing and all types of housing, from high-rise new construction in New York to retrofits of affordable housing in a ski resort community in New Hampshire, to single-family home ownership for regular folks living in another resort area in Santa Fe, and the Rose is affordable housing in the Twin Cities area. And we're going to talk about two projects, the Phoenix House in Atlanta and the Rose in Minneapolis, as two examples of how affordable housing groups and other organizations are making this all happen in their projects. So with the Phoenix House, this is in Atlanta. As Dana said, it's a project that has good transit access and is along a new area of development in Atlanta called the Beltline, which is the redevelopment of an old circular rail line that goes around the entire city of Atlanta. In the book, we have a narrative for each case where we set it in its climate context. We talk about the programs that it used, and then we go through the what they were able to accomplish, what kind of a project it is. Phoenix House is housing, supported services housing for formerly homeless people and usually people who also have had strong challenges with mental health as well. It's a combination of new construction and renovation of an existing building, and they were able to accomplish many green things. They really paid attention to stormwater management, which is a big problem in the Atlanta area. And because of the structure of this housing, Phoenix House pays all of the utilities, and they did not want to have residents who have many other life challenges needing to worry about whether or not they paid their energy bills. So they pay all the bills, and they're very tuned into that. And even though they do not have tenants pay the bills, they actually sub-meter the water and the electricity for all units so that they can track the use and can work with residents if they discover patterns of excess use and are able to work with those tenants directly to reduce their energy consumption. And they really created indoor-outdoor connections with many spaces in the shade, on balconies, in the central courtyard, under the gazebo, where people can connect with nature in what is otherwise a fairly urbanized area. The Rose is a development by Aon, a very strong affordable housing developer in the Twin Cities, and they certified this project to the Enterprise Green Communities standard. They did a number of green things. It's an urban infill site. It has transit access. It also has a big focus on stormwater management. They put in a large community garden. But a big emphasis at the Rose was thinking about the toxicity and the materials choices and really focusing on the health. And that was where Dana, through the JPB Foundation, was able to give Aon some additional resources that enabled them to use the Living Building Challenge program's approach to really drill into what materials they were choosing and what the health characteristics of those materials were. And then after choosing good materials, they made other really important moves for better indoor air quality with high quality ventilation systems. It's a no smoking building. And they made sure that the systems for heating and cooling were right sized and had controls so that each family in its own apartment would be able to be comfortable and do so affordably. And from talking to the organizations, building the cases, catching up with other people as we researched and updated the content of the book, we realized that the groups that have really bought into and stick with the fundamentals are the ones that seem best positioned to grow. We know there are housing finance agencies requiring green, and there is, I'm sure those of you who are in the industry know there are developers who do it because it's required. But we found that the developers who do it because they found that it's fundamental to what they do, and that it's something that they want to always do and do better, they are the stronger organizations when it comes to thinking about what's coming next. And we found that the examples of where this works are where teams have figured out how to collaborate, where there's a shared vision and a commitment and a building of trust. Dana called it integrated design as an approach that's bringing the whole design team, the stakeholders, the organization together to really build and share goals to make the project happen. We also found that thinking about climate and resilience is really critical and has to be incorporated into all projects and plans, and that the forward-leaning organizations are already starting to do that. And our other finding was that many organizations started out doing a green project, either because they thought it seemed like an interesting idea, or they believed in the principles, or it was required by a funding source. But for those organizations, once they started doing it, it was a catalyst for them to really commit to green broadly across their organizations. And that has been transformative for organization after organization as we spoke with them. And so that brings us to the trends. Now Walker and I wrote this book mostly in 2019. And so it was before we hit the COVID crisis. It was before George Floyd was killed. And we could see that these trends were coming, and it felt like as our book was coming out, we just slammed into all of them. And so as Dana said, you know, we can solve these things if we tackle them together. If we set them off against each other and say, well, we can think about climate, but we can't think about affordability. Well, we can think about health, but we don't need to worry about social equity. That is not going to work. And that is, it might make an interesting building, but it's not going to solve the systems problem. So we hope that our book, The Blueprint for Greening Affordable Housing, really helps the affordable housing industry to refresh their understanding and really solidify how they apply the basic fundamentals of green building to their projects, and that by doing so, we can be part of the systems change that Dana is calling for. Thank you. Oh, Dawn, you're on mute.
Excellent. Thank you. I was just about to say I'm doing a tech check. Can folks hear me and see me? Kim, can you hear me and see me?
I can hear you and see you, yes.
Awesome. Well, so hello everyone. I'm Dawn Phillips. I'm the director at the Rights to the City Alliance, and it's an honor to be here today, Dana, with Dana and Kim, and to be able to get to talk about the really important books, contributions that the both of you have made to just kind of thinking through and attempting to bring more justice to the housing and climate situation here in the United States. Thank you also to Island Press for the invitation to join the conversation. So in listening to what the both of you shared, I have to say that the way we understand the housing and climate crisis at Right to the City, as well as for the 90-something community groups that are a part of our network, I think we share a very similar understanding of the crises and by and large to what caused the crises. So we have an understanding that the housing and climate crisis are a part of the kind of structural, systematic, and historic inequities that have been built into and baked into the DNA, if you will, of this country. Dana, in your book, you talked about the history of white supremacy, of racial discrimination, We certainly understand that to be at the heart, the beating heart of inequity generally, and certainly kind of what's driving the climate and housing crisis today. And so in our work, our central assumption is that because the climate and housing crisis are historic, structural, and systemic, our sense is that in order to transform the housing and the climate crisis, it's really going to require more than policy and technical fixes, right? Because we are going to need an accompanying kind of more wholesale social, political, and economic transformation to really kind of scale the kinds of solutions, Kim, that you just shared, the example of the roads, these projects that we know are possible, right? Using the green communities criteria, using the tools that you all have studied and promoted, like these solutions are possible, but in order to scale them, we really need much more, frankly, political will, including from legislators from the federal all the way down to the local, to really shift priorities. And you see here, this is again very connected to the organizing that folks are doing to reimagine policing, for example. I think the work of reimagining climate and reimagining housing in this moment in this country right now, these are all in deeply connected and intersecting with each other, right? Because what it requires is a focus away, as the both of you talked about in your books, from extractive, exploitative systems and approaches that have really been the history, certainly of the last 50, 60 years of climate and housing policy in this country, and not just policy, but also how climate and housing solutions have been funded, or more specifically, not funded, not invested in the last 50 to 60 years, to a regenerative, resilient, sustainable, and green, if you will, approach where we actually center impacted residents, working class, low income communities of color, Black, Indigenous, immigrant communities, et cetera, in really defining what community development looks like for them in their communities, really being able to play the central role. So I think the one kind of difference, nuance between how we think about the work, and Kim, how you and Dana laid it out a little bit, is, Kim, in your chart, we would place residents at the center, with all love and respect to those project managers. Our sense is that it's not just a moral assertion that folks who have been historically negatively impacted by these systems of climate and housing injustice being at the center. It's not just a moral assertion, but it's a strategic assertion, because our sense is that the solutions, the ideas, the approaches that come out of the minds and the imaginations of folks who have been dealing firsthand with these crises for generations, they are best positioned, right, to some extent, not just in terms of, using, evolving, making dynamic these frameworks and tools that the both of you are proposing, but also because there is indigenous wisdom, there is a knowledge base, there is a wisdom in the collective understanding of many of these communities and these peoples about what it takes and what it will take and what they would like it to take to develop their communities, not only green, but in their image, politically, culturally, socially. And so the bringing together of the analysis and the framework, Dana, I think that you and Kim are putting out, with a strong sense that the leadership, the initiative, the drive of these peoples and communities have to lead that process. And also because that is the way that we actually build up the collective social appetite, and in some cases, the power necessary to shift the structures and systems that have led us to these crises in the first place. So for us, we would say that there is no way to solve the housing and the climate crisis without shifting to some extent, not only just the political, social, and economic structures, but the power structure that is built into the society in terms of how policy, funding, decisions are being made, how communities are being designed, how community needs are being understood and resolved, that all of this is kind of tied up with each other. So our work would definitely require, build on the frameworks that you all are proposing and that you've shared here. And, Kim, I think in the way that your book, frankly, provides a very clear and succinct way to walk the community through how you go about doing the type of housing production that actually serves the community. We would add to these frameworks and analysis the central understanding that we have to build power for these communities, that these communities have to be supported in being able to self-determine their vision and direction, and that long-term, these communities have to be in stewardship of not just the processes, but the actual projects, the actual housing, the actual community infrastructure that's being located where they live, work, play, worship, etc. So I want to thank you both for that, and I want to see if I can pose a question to the both of you to kick off our discussion. So I wanted to ask if the both of you could talk about the green housing framework and its relationship to impacted residents, folks in historically disenfranchised, disinvested communities, et cetera. And specifically, if you could speak to the relationships that you understand residents needing to play in, firstly, the visioning of that housing and community development work, their relationship and role in the kind of project development phase of that work, and most importantly, their role in the long-term stewardship and management of development and housing, community development projects and housing in folks' communities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn. And everything you said was spot on, and I couldn't agree more at all with what you were saying, and so thankful for the amazing leadership you're providing and work you're doing through Right to the City Alliance. One of the things I try to hammer home in my book is that this is about a new way of thinking. This isn't just, adding on some green bling. This is about a fundamental shift in the way we're thinking about these crises, as you're saying, and putting the people and planet first. And it's not just even about the final product and having resident control of that and determination of what happens right there in their own community. It's also about who owns and drives all of the inputs and additional sort of systems that impact community development. I speak a lot about the need also that the people in these communities need to be the ones retrofitting it. They need to be owning the manufacturing facilities that are making the materials. And, so it's a tremendous transformation. This is not easy. And the number one item I call for at the end in my call to action is a national commitment across the federal agencies to fundamentally stop extracting from communities, doing things for and to communities, and allowing our country to heal and address these issues that go way back, forcibly removing, Indigenous persons from the East Coast to the West Coast. Those were maps that our public officials drew up and enforced. And we continue to draw up maps and push people around. And so, that it's just enough. I think we're all calling for enough is enough, and to put people and planet front and center, and to actually transform the way we think about our communities so that we are working with and for the people who live there and for whom this is their culture and their identity and their future. And I couldn't agree more. I think that is exactly what needs to be done.
And I love the focus on the systems change, Dawn, and that is so right, and of course a big focus of Dana's book as well. And I would say that Walker and I don't view our book as the end of the story. It's kind of the necessary condition of having strong organizations that are able to consistently deliver is what enables organizations to move into the space you're asking for. But to answer the question you asked, what we found as we talked with organizations trying to figure out which projects to feature as cases in the book, and then as we met the organizations who built the projects that we did include, we found that the more they focused on equity, the more they tried to engage residents one way or another. And in new construction, it's tricky because you're building for people who are going to live there 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. And so it's hard to engage those people. But the best organizations have found ways to engage residents at properties they already are owning and operating in conversations about what would you like to see new, what could be better, what could be different, and engaging community stakeholders in that dialogue to say, if we're going to be building here, how can we build something that's additive to the value you want to create in this community. So I think we do have some models for how organizations are beginning to tackle that. I would say to Dana's points about, and your points about systems change and the power dynamics, we have these challenges that for new construction, the primary funding source for rental housing is the low-income housing tax credits. Well, extremely difficult for a tenant-driven organization to be the lead owner and developer in that situation. People are looking for millions of dollars of operating reserves and other funds that are just not available. The whole system has been set up to make it impossible for tenants to own the property. So I think if we are clear on what we want to accomplish, we have to keep pushing on the power and the systems and the structures to say we need different models of ownership of the resources when we're done with all of this, so that we can really empower persons, households, communities to be in charge of their destinies while living in an affordable, healthy, beautiful place.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Dana. And we're starting to get questions trickling in from our participants. I'm going to get to them shortly. But just one more follow-up to the both of you from what you just put out. Can the both of you share, and Dana, I'm going to pass it back to you first. Can the both of you share a little bit more about how you think we start to do this kind of political shift? So Kim, when you were saying, we need to push the way the financing works, and the financing is being determined by, agencies, entities, etc. It's a very known, to some extent, it's both obscure, highly complex, but also highly known. These are very established processes of how financing is being, decisions about financing are being done, how finances are being allocated, what the restrictions and parameters that are put on that funding that either promotes or doesn't or prevents equity. So Dana and Kim, like, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more in your experience, in terms of the work that you've done, what do you think it will take to shift? And Dana, part of what you said earlier is also like, these shifts are necessary to scale up the solutions, right? So firstly, how do we make the shifts, really? And if we were to make the shifts, what does that make possible?
Yeah, that's great. And getting specific is not my strength, but I will do my best on.
And I would say, thank goodness he gave that question to you first.
I mean, I sort of see it in a couple of buckets, that continue to find and resource, lift up communities who are doing this work, so communities that have found a way to gain ownership of either their property or, collection of homes in their communities, whatever it is, through a community land trust or some other model. Continue resourcing that and allowing that to grow from the ground up, because I feel that you always have to encourage the leaders, and that's where philanthropy can come in and really help drive more of that work. The middle bucket for me is sort of the hardest. How do you then help enough people to see what's possible and to understand those different ways of doing things, and providing those roadmaps so other communities can say, wow, I love what they did in Oakland, how can I do that in Kalamazoo? Or so you have to, I think, also then not just resource the leaders and those communities to do that work, but to find ways then to sort of unpack what happened so that others could have a go at it. And then I do think, once we see some things that are working, we have to sort of codify that, get it into policy, and change the rules of the game. And quite frankly, that's one of the things I'm probably more excited about right now, is the opportunity to potentially change the rules of the game with an administration who says, at least, that they want to address racial equity and climate change and address these other economic and injustices in our country. So when an administration says, I'm going to commit 40% of all the clean energy and climate change dollars to underserved communities, all three of us know that's not going to happen overnight or just on its own. So we, I think, have to be working very hard now to support communities. And there is something called the Justice 40 Accelerator, which I could put in the chat, the website, to do this, to help communities understand the rules of the game, but also then work with the agencies and the policymakers to change the rules of the game. And so if we're doing both at the same time, I think this will take a number of years, but it begins to set us on a different course. And I think acknowledging the rules of the game aren't working. Well, they're working for those they were intended to work for, but they're not working for the majority of our country. And we have to change those rules. So resource those communities to do the great work they want to lead on, find those stories and share them in ways that can be replicated, and change the policy and make this just how we do business.
Thank you, Dana. That's great. Kim, I don't know if you're going to be excited or not, but I'm actually going to pose one of the questions that came through the chat to you instead,
Sure.
Given that Dana did a whole lot on that last question. Thank you, Dana. So, Kim, here's the question, and I'm going to try to read it slowly, and you tell me if you need me to repeat it. So the question is, what are some techniques for engaging the community? With the digital divide, the challenges for working people to contribute, and the attitude of some that nothing will change no matter what feedback they give, how can we include everyone in the land development process?
That is a challenging question. The, the, the groups that I have seen and have worked with that are doing this try to meet people where they're at. And so part of it is, instead of inviting people to a meeting, they go out to the public square and set up a table at the farmer's market and ask questions. When they do invite people in, they try to think about the timing so that sometimes sessions are in the evening, but other times they're on a Saturday afternoon. And they try to provide childcare and food so that families don't have to try to find someone to take care of the kids and get dinner made. They can easily come. Other groups are saying, you know what, when I go to those meetings, I'm paid. When you go to those meetings, you're paid. What about paying the residents? Why should we assume that the value to them is for some undefined, indefinite, not clear when it will be delivered future possible benefits, right? And so I think it's no one of those approaches works, but the creative organizations try all of those in some mix over time as they're talking about a project and really work out. And then of course, trying to deal with language barriers as well. And one of my pet peeves as an English speaker going to these meetings is that everything is done in English, and the non-English speaking people are asked to wear the headphones and to wait for the translation and to think of and it's like, why are we not conducting this meeting in Spanish or in Haitian and letting me wait for the translation? Let's try to balance things better so that we're not constantly creating these inequities around things as basic as the language that we're conducting the meeting in. So I think when groups are thoughtful, they can expand the conversation and find ways to use digital tools when they are more available to a broader set of people, but look for ways to really reach out and find people where they're at and to get over some of those traditional barriers to participation.
Thank you so much. I'm just taking a minute here to look through some of these questions. So then I'm gonna have you start with this one, which might or might not be our last question for the session. But it says here, in this moment, housing costs around the country are skyrocketing for both new home purchase and rental housing. In addition, lumber prices are staggeringly high. How can sustainable green housing break through in this moment of such extremes?
Yeah, great question. And that's exactly the right question. If we start to imagine that there's a different way of doing things, if we imagine that there's a different way of thinking about how to address our climate crisis and our housing crisis together, it opens up these possibilities. The first thing I talk about in my book actually is a community that was impacted by the lumber industry. But I think the question is getting at something even more than that. We have the opportunity to rethink how we're delivering housing in a way that is way more sustainable in the types of products that we're using. We cannot continue to meet our climate goals with the kinds of materials we are deploying on a regular basis through our gray housing developments, because the amount of embodied carbon in those materials is astronomical, and we cannot meet our goals that way. So I see new materials, new ways of prefabricating homes that allow us to explore using, and I'm not a scientist, but sort of the mushroom industry is helping us think about new building materials that is much more sustainable, rapidly renewable. And actually, we're funding at JPB some thinking around what are better actual green materials that are not toxic and are more renewable. So I'm very optimistic actually about that future, because we've really sort of, I think, come to the end of the road in our conventional ways of using lumber and concrete and, you know, things that we know are both adding to our climate carbon emissions and deteriorating our planet. So I think that that's a place, and the Healthy Building Network is a good source of information for different kinds of materials that are more sustainable and healthy.
Thank you, Dana. So folks, we are going to get ready to close. And before we do that, Kim, I'm going to ask you if you want to share any kind of closing wrap-up thoughts. And then Dana, if you have any after Kim, please share. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jen from Island Press to close us out. So Kim, closing thoughts if you have them.
Sure. And Dawn, my closing thoughts are in part in response to the question you asked that I didn't get a chance to answer, which is, yes, we need to build green buildings, and that has to be fundamental. People need to be able to do that with less work and less effort and less having to start from scratch on the thinking every time. So the more we build out a system for that, the better. But the power of coalitions and speaking with one voice to create multiple solutions, and to not, you know, to resist the urge to say, well, the tax credit system has worked, so let's scale that up. But to say, no, let's double the money, but let's think about some other ways to distribute it that give us more options for ways that properties can be owned and developed. And so I think the work that you're doing with your alliance to really build a strong shared voice that cuts across communities, cuts across geographies, and says, no, we can do it a different way is really important. So encouraging everyone to focus on the fundamentals, but to, you know, lean forward and work together to speak with one voice for better solutions.
Yeah, I'll just make sure I'm not muted. I don't think I am. Thanks for this. And what a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could go all day. Thanks to the great questions from everyone listening. And I'll just end by saying, you know, we're all connected, and we all benefit from clean water, clean soil, clean air to breathe. And, you know, what we've been talking about today is just fundamental, that we need to fully understand that we are connected to one another, and find these places of intersection to address these dual crises. And there's more than just the housing and climate crisis. And it's so how do we come together and just make a quantum leap together, think differently, and reimagine how our country can be, and put people at the center, as Don so clearly called us to do. I could not agree more. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time today. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Kim and Dana. Thank you, Don, for the excellent moderation and for your perspectives here. If you're interested in either of Dana or Kim's books, please go to islandpress.org and enter the code webinar at checkout for 30% off. We encourage you to do the survey as you exit, and I'll have the recording out to you in the next few days. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.